This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. The front page of the Evening Standard splashes a plea from the government to not risk all the hard work done now. It's from Justice Secretary Robert Buckland and comes as the lockdown shows signs of fraying. There are reports of more people on the streets and in parks. Traffic levels on the roads appear to be increasing. Businesses are pushing for restrictions to be lifted. Wetherspoons has slightly backtracked on a pledge to reopen around June by now adding with permission. That doesn't look like it's coming soon, but inside the paper and available online, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has written about the challenges and opportunities that face the city when this is over. And he joins me now over Zoom. Mr. Khan, first of all, is London ready to come out of lockdown?
Well, it's been quite remarkable, London's response to COVID-19. We followed the advice and the vast majority of Londoners have stayed at home. And that by staying at home, they've saved lives by protecting the NHS. It is the case now that I think it's time to treat Londoners like adults and involve them in the conversation about what easing lockdown, about what modifying lockdown looks like. And in my view, we will not return to business as usual, and there will be a new normal. And it's really important to involve Londoners in that conversation.
You say treating people like adults there, and you've written that in your column for the Evening Standard today as well. Do you feel that people aren't being treated like adults?
Yeah, I'm well aware of conversations taking place within government that the public aren't privy to about the sort of options the government is considering. And I compare and contrast the response of governments around the world who have been honest with residents about what modifying lockdown, what lifting lockdown looks like. I speak regularly to the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales, and both Nicola Sturgeon, but also Mark Drakeford have published a framework of what lifting lockdown would mean. And I think we should have that same adult conversation with Londoners and indeed the rest of England about what the new normal means.
Are you then having trouble speaking to central government in getting help for London?
I'm really pleased to report to Evening Standard readers that actually we've got very good relationships with government. I was frustrated at the delay in Boris Johnson involving me as the mayor with Cobra meetings and the delay in getting London around the table. But eventually we were invited around the table, eventually we're involved. I've been really impressed by the way the civil servants works with City Hall officials and myself, but actually the way Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and our government in Downing Street has been working collegially together. My argument is that we should involve the public as well in some of the conversations we're having behind closed doors, because actually we will need the goodwill, the cooperation and the support of the public if we're going to defeat COVID-19.
And you've also written about the necessity for furloughing to continue. Can that really be done after lockdown is lifted?
One of the things I support is the Chancellor's announcement in the various financial packages for individuals and for businesses. I've been lobbying for support, particularly for those who are currently missing out. Those in 0 hours contracts, those who work in the gig economy. I think the point is this: I think some sectors may be able to ease the lifting of lockdown quicker than other sectors. So, for example, I suspect that one of the first sectors coming out of lockdown will be construction, and so that means that the government can relieve the pressure on their finances by not having a furlough scheme for those in construction. But it is the case those who work in pubs, those who work in culture, those who work in the creative industries won't be able to come out of lockdown as quick or have their lockdown eased. And for them, they'll need to be support in the longer term, because what we don't want is these people being unemployed, these businesses going bust, which will be a bigger burden on the taxpayer in the medium to long term, but actually causes huge misery to those individuals and businesses involved.
One of the biggest challenges I would expect is transport and transport for London. Is it ready for people returning to work?
Well, we're at the moment working on plans for lockdown being modified or eased and working about what that would mean. But let me tell you just one example of the challenge. On a normal day before lockdown, a carriage on the Underground would carry, roughly speaking, 125 people. At the moment, to respect social distancing rules, really important, a carriage is carrying 20 people rather than 125. Now, if we're going to ease out of lockdown, we need to realise that actually we won't be able to socially distance on public transport, on tubes, on buses, on trams, or overground. That means a number of things. Firstly, it means we need to learn the lessons from around the world, but also listen to experts in this country and around the world who are saying we may need to wear non-medical facial coverings to stop ourselves inadvertently passing on the virus when we are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. But the second point is that we TfL rely upon the fares from passengers to pay for the services we provide. For the last 5-6 weeks, we've lost more than 90% of our income because, for good reasons, there have been fewer people using public transport. We can't afford to run public transport unless the government gives TfL a grant to support us doing so. So if we're going to ease lockdown, if we're going to continue providing public transport, not just for essential workers, but for others that start resuming to work, we will need support from the government to be able to provide a public transport system in London.
But it sounds like London is going to need a lot of financial support from the government at a time when the entire UK economy is going to be taking a hit.
Well, the good news is we normally punch well above our weight. We contribute, roughly speaking, between 20 and 25% of our country's gross value added. And so we contribute far more in taxes to central government than we receive. I'm not wishing to declare independence for London and become a city-state. What I'm saying is actually it's in the government's interest, it's in the nation's interest to get London back on our feet sooner rather than later. And that's why we will need support from the government in the form of grants for transport, in relation to extension of furlough to some sectors, because actually the more help we get from the government in the short term, the more we'll be able to resume contributing to our country's prosperity sooner rather than later.
When we eventually do come out of lockdown, in the first stages, there may not be restaurants open, there may not be bars open. London's going to feel really different, isn't it?
Well, London will feel different when lockdown is lifted. There won't be the bars, the restaurants, the pubs that many of us went to mix, to interact, to fall in love, to have a good time, to raise our spirits. And we'll have to find new ways of doing that. There won't be, for some time, social spaces being occupied in the way they were in the past. There won't be mass sporting events. We're a city that, in my view, is the cultural capital of the world. That is the sporting capital of the world. Well, you're not going to get the Wimbledons or cricket or filled music venues for some time yet. We'll have to find new ways to keep ourselves occupied, to keep in good mental health, but also recognise that actually 1 out of 6 jobs in London is in the cultural and creative industries. We've got to make sure we look after those people in those areas. So what we're doing from City Hall is providing additional financial assistance and support in kind to these various cultural and creative industries. We've announced today a £2.3 million package from City Hall. I just remind viewers of this, after the Second World War, there literally weren't the live music venues and the pubs and the bars because they'd been bombed. And we managed to literally rebuild physically these spaces for us to enjoy each other's company. And so although these physical spaces will exist, we won't be able to enjoy them. So I think the challenge is less big in some instances, but I think you're right. We've got to be prepared for a future, in the short term, at least in London, that is nothing like any of us in our lifetimes have experienced.
And you can read Sadiq Khan's article in the Evening Standard newspaper or online at standard.co.uk. Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.